This morning, we're beginning a brand new series, a series entitled Creating Culture. Creating culture. Well, what is culture? Well, a simple definition, if you're looking at a dictionary, it would say this: the sum total of ways of living built up by a group of human beings and transmitted from one generation to another. So in a way, culture is kind of what defines us, right? It kind of defines us as a people. It's as if we as a society have established a code to live by. A set of standards, some good, some perhaps not so good. In America, we live by a certain cultural norm. In fact, from a very early age, we are kind of indoctrinated by what we call the American dream, right? Some might say the American dream is no longer alive, but what is that? What is the American dream? Well, we're taught this. We're taught at a very young age that we need to do well in school. We need to study hard in school. Why? So when we get out of school, we can get a good job. And so if we get a good job, we can make a lot of money. And if we make a lot of money, we're going to be happy. It's going to make us happy. And that's kind of the summation of it. Younger generations, though, those in their 20s and even 30s are kind of pushing back at that today. And they would even say, no, it's not so much about acquiring stuff, but it's more about experiencing new things. It's about experiences. It's about adventure. It's about travel. That's kind of the American dream. Well, whatever it is, ultimately, it's a culture of looking out for number one. It's a culture of bringing pleasure to us, to number one, me. The American dream or the American culture is not all bad. I'm not saying that. It's not all a bad thing. But ultimately, it's a pursuit of personal gain is what it's about. To get all you can get while the getting is still good. Experience as much as you possibly can while you can. And in doing so, happiness will be achieved in your life. Well, in God's economy, it's entirely different. That is not the way God sees it. God calls us to something entirely different. God calls us to embrace a different culture, a different kind of culture. In fact, we'll see this morning, he tells us to fight against some of this stuff, fight against this culture. Well, what does that look like? Well, over the next 7 weeks, we're going to be unpacking that a little bit of this culture, of this culture that God has called us into. And it's not even so much called us into, but I believe to create. If we can create this culture, we'll have that much more impact on our community and the culture at large around us. So we're going to be looking at things like a culture of compassion. This morning, we're going to look at that. We're going to look at a culture of authenticity. How can we create, as God's people, a culture of authenticity? And then a culture of worship, a culture of grace and truth, a culture of sacrifice. On Father's Day, appropriately, we'll look at a culture of godly manhood. What does that look like? How do we do that? And we'll look at a culture of the body of Christ, living in the body of Christ. But today I want to look at compassion. A culture of compassion. What is that? What is compassion? Well, I came across an author's description of it, a gentleman by the name of Frederick Buechner. He says this. He says, compassion is something, or is sometimes the fatal capacity for feeling what it's like to live inside somebody else's skin. It is the knowledge that there can never really be any peace and joy for me until there is peace and joy finally for you too. I like that. I think that's so good. Why? Because it highlights the fact that compassion is so much more than a feeling. It's more than a feeling. It's one thing to feel for someone. It's an entirely different thing when we can convert that feeling into action. And that's what compassion does. And that's what God calls us to. You see, because to merely feel for someone, to merely feel someone's pain, it would be sympathy, to be sympathetic or empathetic. But those are merely feelings that fall short. They fall short of action. And compassion takes the next step from feelings and takes action. Well, how about God's definition? Look at Proverbs 31, verses 8 and 9. He says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those being crushed. Yes, speak up for the poor and the helpless and see that they get justice. Well, this morning I want to unpack that a bit and take a look at what it really means to live this out, what it means to live a culture of compassion. So if you haven't pulled your outline out, let me invite you to do that. It'll help you following along this morning together. Number one, a compassionate person accomplishes the mission of God. We live in a broken world. We all know that. We live in a world that from the moment that sin entered this world, and we read about that in Genesis chapter 3, from the moment that sin entered the world, God has had his people on a mission to bring restoration, to restore this broken world, to restore relationship with him. The effects of that sin on this world have been devastating. We all know that. But here's the thing, it was never God's plan. When God created this world, when God created man, it was never his plan for it to go awry and for sin to enter into it, for people to experience pain and to suffer. But that, because of sin, that is the state that we find ourselves in. Let me just share some statistics. There are nearly 1 billion people on planet Earth today that are chronically short of food. Many of them slowly starving to death. You know that's 3 times the population of the United States? 3 times our population, and they're slowly starving to death because they're chronically without food. 783 million people in this world have no access to clean water. And yeah, we don't give it a second thought. We just go turn on the tap and we never think about it. But 783 million people don't even have access to clean water. More than 1/3 of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day. And more than 3/4 of the world's population lives on less than $10 a day. That means that 75% of this world's population lives on $10 or less a day. Now think about it. Let me just put this into context. What does that mean for us? If you earn an income of just $40,000 a year, $40,000, if you can earn that much, you make more money than 99% of this world's population. Amazing. Here in Oregon, 1 in 6 people in Oregon struggle with hunger. 1 in 6. The national average for child food insecurity is 22.4%. In Oregon, where Oregon ranks 4th in the nation for child food insecurity, with 29.1% of our children living in food insecurity. Well, let's bring this even closer to home, okay? Of the 450 children enrolled at Malala Elementary School, 67% of them qualify for the free or reduced breakfast and lunch program. There is need, there is struggle all around us. And you know what? This kind of struggle was never God's plan. And you might be saying, yeah, Pastor Brian, I get that, I understand that, but you don't understand. I got enough troubles of my own. I got all kinds of stuff going on in my life. I got my own struggles and issues. How could I possibly respond to this enormous need that you're talking to? Well, we still can. We still can live lives of compassion. That might be true for you. That might be true for many of us, and yet God still calls us to live that way. In fact, some of the most compassionate people I have ever known, that I have ever met, are those with so very little, oftentimes living in poverty, and they've got bigger hearts of compassion than most people. In fact, statistics even back that up. In 2011, a survey showed that Americans earning in the top 20% of income levels in our country contributed on average 1.3% of their income to charity. So those in the top 20%, whereas those in the bottom 20% of income levels donated 3.2% of their income. That's more than double than their wealthier counterparts. But here's the truth. I don't know if you ever considered this before. We have won the lottery. We really have. I'm not talking about mega bucks or the lottery that we play, but we've won a lottery. We have won what I call the birth lottery, simply because of where we were born. Not a one of us had a choice. and where we were born. But because of where we were born, because of what God has blessed us with, we have this incredible opportunity to live lives of compassion. This hits home with me in such a big way a number of years ago. About 20 years ago, I lived in California. I lived in the San Diego area. In fact, I lived south of San Diego, about 6 miles from the Mexico-U.S. border. And I spent a good amount of time in Mexico and doing ministry down there and getting to know people down there. And I remember thinking, I remember just literally standing at the border, and you look in one direction and there's extreme extreme poverty. And you look the other way and there's extreme wealth. And I remember just asking myself, why is that? And why was I born on the north side of that line? And I wrestled with that, and I wondered, God, why have you blessed me with so much when so many others in this world suffer so greatly? And here's what I've concluded. I've concluded that we have been blessed so that we can be a blessing. So that we can be a blessing to other people. And God expects that. God expects that of us. In fact, so much so, I think it's even tied to our salvation a little bit. Now, before you start thinking, oh boy, he's like a works guy, No, I'm not saying that. We don't earn our salvation by anything we do. Salvation is a free gift of God, a free gift of grace. But look at some of these words that Jesus said. In Matthew chapter 25, we read this story. He describes this scene in this big judgment scene. And it says that Jesus is sitting on the throne, and it tells us that he divides the people in half. And he puts half the people on the right and half the people on the left. It says, much like a shepherd would separate the sheep from the goats. And he put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And then this is what he says in Matthew 25, starting at verse 34. It says, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you invited me into your home. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you cared for me. I was in prison and you visited me. And the people standing there, the Bible goes on to say, and they're like, wait, what? Jesus, when? When did we see you hungry? When did we see you thirsty or lonely or needing clothes? And he will say to them, he says, when you did it even to the least of my brothers or sisters, you did it to me. Come on in. Welcome to my kingdom prepared for you. And then it says he turns to the people on his left, the goats, and he says, depart from me. Depart from me. You are not welcome here in heaven because you did not help me when I was hungry. You did not help me when I was thirsty, when I was lonely, when I was needing clothes. And the Bible says they too will be scratching their head going, what, when? When did we ever see you in need, Jesus? And he replied to them, what you did not do for the least of these, you did not do for me. Man, those are powerful words, folks. Compassion is an expectation. God expects us to live in this culture of compassion. We're part of God's plan, like I was saying earlier, to bring restoration to this broken world, and there's expectation upon us to live out this mission of compassion. But here's the thing. In order for that to happen, we've got to get our hands dirty. We got to get in there and get our hands dirty. It requires that we step away from our own worlds and into the world of someone else, into the world of someone that's struggling, that's suffering. And yet oftentimes, instead of that, we take the approach of this poem. Listen to this. It says, I was hungry and you formed humanity clubs and you discussed my hunger. Thank you. I was imprisoned and you crept off quietly to your chapel in the cellar to pray for my release. I was naked and in your mind you debated the morality of my appearance. I was sick and you knelt and thanked God for your health. I was homeless and you preached to me of the spiritual shelter of the love of God. I was lonely and you left me alone to pray for me. You seem so holy, so close to God, but I am still very hungry and lonely and cold. So where have your prayers gone? What have they done? What does it profit a man to page through his book of prayers when the rest of the world is crying for help? When we step away from our own comforts and step into the pain and the struggle of another person, we fulfill the mission of God. And when we do that, we put his love on display because a compassionate person displays the love of God. It's through our acts of compassion that his love is seen and experienced. Look at 1 John 3:16 and 17. He says, we know what real love is. Why? Because Jesus gave up his life for us. So we also ought to give up our lives for our brothers and sisters. If someone has enough money to live well and sees a brother or sister in need, but shows no compassion, how can the love of God be in that person? It's when we show compassion to people that the love of God is seen. And why is that? Because the love of God is in us. If we belong to Jesus, we have his love in us. And so when we live in this manner, it's seen because compassion is love in action. Again, it's not just a feeling, but it's action. It's putting that love into action. The very next verse, 1 John 3:18, it continues. It says, dear children, let us not merely say that we love each other. Let us show the truth. How? By our actions. Let's show it by our actions. It's so much more than a feeling. It's more than talk, but it's action. Compassion is seeing a need and meeting that need. And this kind of love requires that we join God in his mission, which is what? Restoration, right? His mission of restoration. It requires that we go to where the needs are, that we join him in that. And can I just say, I love how Foothills has done that. I love how this church has been so committed for years in our ministry in Guatemala, because the needs in Guatemala are so great. I don't know if you know this or not, but nearly half of all children in Guatemala, 50% of all the children in Guatemala are malnourished. They don't have enough food, which in turn introduces a whole host of other issues and problems and challenges. And again, this was never God's plan. That breaks the heart of God, and it should break our heart as well. But what I love that he's done, he has literally flung the doors wide open to Foothills and then said, join me. Join me here in my effort to bring restoration to the brokenness in Guatemala. Let me just share an example of how he's doing that. This last month, I was part of a team that went to Guatemala, and we spent some time at a couple schools like we usually do, the Light of the World School, a school in San Lucas up near Guatemala City, and just spent time with children, shared Jesus with them, loved them, did different programs and ministries with them, visited our sponsored children. But one day we went to a place called the Kairos House. And the Kairos House is in Guatemala City. It's right in the middle of the city. And the Kairos House is a place that hosts families that come in from far-reaching areas, outlying areas of Guatemala. Why? Because they have children that many of them are terminally ill. Many of them have cancer, and they need treatment. And so they come all the way into the city so they can get treatment at the hospital in Guatemala City. And if it were not for a place like the Kairos House, many of them would have no choice but to live on the streets while their children are receiving care. And so this ministry, the Kairos House, began. And so we went and we spent some time there. We did some work for them. We painted the front of their building. And then we went in and we just sat with the people. We had a bunch of toys that so many of you donated. We gave these toys to the children and the adults, some different things, and just spent time with them. But we met a little girl there, a little girl named Adelita, and I have a picture of her on the screen. Adelita has one leg, and just such a sweet girl. All the children in there are just struggling with some extreme health issues, but Adelita is missing a leg, and we still don't even know the full story as to why. But I do know that God wants to bring restoration to Adelita and her family and the other kids and the other people there at the Kairos House. And as we were spending time with them, her father approached one of us on our team. And he began to just pour his heart out and said, look, we don't have any money. We don't have the means to get my daughter a new leg. Is there a way that you can get that for us? Is there anything that you can do? Well, of course, we can't say, well, yeah, we'll just run out to the van and get one. We couldn't make a promise that we can do this, but we said, we'll pray about that. we will talk to God and we will ask God, who loves you, if he could do this thing, if he will provide this leg. And we weren't sure what God was going to do, but we just began to pray. Well, one of the members on our team, Vicky Nordby, was with us. And I remember as we were planning to go, she was even kind of wondering, why is God even calling me to Guatemala? I'm not sure what he's going to do. What's he going to do in me? How is he going to use me there? But I do know that he's called me to step out of my world and into the world of someone else and show compassion. And so she was there. And man, God got her heart at the Kairos house. And she talked with Adelita and her father and the director there. And she went home. When we came home, upon arriving home, she went to work. She's a nurse. She's a nurse's consultant for a nursing home company. And she went to her employer and she shared the story about this little girl needing a leg. And her employer said, we can do that. We will get her a leg. And they agreed to provide that leg. That is God at work, folks. That is God at work, yeah. And why? Because God's people, because Foothills join God in what he wants to do and bring restoration. And Adelita and her family are experiencing the love of God. Would you pray? When we've contacted Priscilla, the director of Kairos House, and shared this news with her, this girl and her family had already left. But they're coming back on June 7th for more treatment. So would you pray that God just works out the details for all this to happen so that we can be a blessing to her in that way? And you know, when we do things like that, that honors God. A compassionate person honors God. That brings so much honor to him. And yet in our society, we live in a culture that says what? Honor yourself, right? Honor me. Honor yourself. Believe in yourself. Bring pleasure to yourself. Get your hands on all the latest and greatest gadgets and things. It's a very narcissistic approach to life. But a person of compassion is more interested in honoring God and meeting the needs of other people. And you know, Jesus' disciples struggled with this. They had a hard time with this concept. Believe it or not, these 12 guys that traveled with Jesus, they had a hard time. And we read about an interesting story or a conversation that Jesus had with them. After they had been traveling, walking down the road for a while, they get to where they were going, Capernaum. And listen to what Jesus said, Mark chapter 9. Verses 33 to 37 says, after they arrived at Capernaum and settled in a house, Jesus asked his disciples, hey guys, what were you discussing back there on the road? But they didn't answer because they had been arguing about which of them was the greatest. Wouldn't you like to have been part of that conversation? Can you imagine walking with the disciples, and Peter's like, John, I'm way better than you. No, God thinks I'm better, It's ridiculous. And Jesus knew that, right? And he says, he sat them down. He called the 12 disciples over to him, and he said, listen, guys, whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else. And then it says, then he put a child among them, and taking that child into his arms, he said to them, anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but my Father who sent me. It is this that honors God. That is what honors God. It's the person who puts their needs aside so that they can meet the needs of someone else. It's a person who says, I'm more concerned about you than about how I'm doing. It's the person that shows love and comes to the aid of a little girl like this. Look at this cute little girl on the screen. Met this girl at one of our sponsored children's house. This property had several dwellings on it, and we were working on one of those houses doing a repair, and right next to it was this house and this little girl. And she kept peeking up out of the window, and she'd see us, and she'd go back down, and she'd come back up, and she'd go back down, and she was standing on her bed, kind of jumping up and down, and had just the most fun time. I thought, I got to get a picture of this little girl. You would not believe how long it took to get that picture, but it was so much fun to see the smile on this little girl, and the joy, and the hope. And you know what Jesus says? When you look into the eyes of a little girl like that, you should see me. See me and love on them. Proverbs 14:31 says, those who oppress the poor insult their maker, but helping the poor honors him. So what we need to know and understand and remember is to put others first is to honor God. Well, you want to know what real worship is. This is it, folks. Honoring God, putting the needs of other people first. James 1:27 says, pure and genuine religion in the sight of God the Father means caring for orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt you. The culture of the world. He's saying, fight against it. Don't let it corrupt you. Fight against the culture of this world. And instead, live out my culture. Live out this culture of compassion. Because when we do, we are going to find that a compassionate person is blessed by God in such tremendous ways. We say it all the time around here that obedience equals blessing. And man, is it never more true than when we live this way. Matthew 10:42. Says, and if you give even a cup of cold water to one of the least of my followers, you will surely be what? Rewarded. You will be blessed. And I don't think he is just talking about eternal rewards. Yes, I believe he's going to reward us and bless us someday when we're in heaven. But you know what? He wants to bless us right now. Right here, right now. God's blessing is both earthly and heavenly. It's both for the here and the now, as well as through all eternity. And I believe the greatest reward that he gives us is hope. It's hope. When we see the hope on the faces of people. Look at these pictures. These little girls or these kids are at the Light of the World school. Do you see what they're doing? They're worshiping their God. They have hope written all over their faces. And I tell you what, there is nothing more rewarding than standing in a circle of these kids as they worship their Lord. Because he has changed their life, because he's restoring brokenness. They're experiencing hope because of him. Yes, we will experience eternal rewards. I have no doubt about it when we are part of God's plan to restore the brokenness here in this world. But when we see the hope that springs from the faces of people is the greatest reward ever. You know, I've every time I go on a mission trip, and I've been on many of them, and I go with a group of people, whether it's abroad or it's a local trip, without exception, every single time I hear a couple of things. I hear things like, you know, I went to be a blessing to others, but I came away feeling so blessed. I hear that every single time. I also hear things like, I went to minister to people, but the people, they ministered to me. And I know so many of you have experienced that. I hear that every time. I personally feel that. Why is that? Because God just delights in blessing those that are living in obedience to him, that are living this life of compassion. You know, the needs are so great. The pain is so real. The injustices of this world are great. And I know as a result, it's so easy for us just to throw our hands up in despair and simply think, how could I possibly make a difference in this world with all this need? Well, it reminds me of a story about a man and a wife, and a husband and wife, and this couple were just kind of at their wits' end. They were exhausted. They were tired. They were just busy to the point of burnout. They had been committed to their work. They were committed to their families. They were committed to their friends. They were committed to their church, but they were just exhausted. And so they decided they needed a break. And so they escaped for a few days of relaxation at an oceanfront hotel. And one night, as they're laying in bed, a violent storm began to lash out against the beach, and giant waves were crashing into the beach and thundering around them. And the man was laying there in bed, just kind of thinking about his own stormy life, thinking about his own struggle and the continuous demands on him because of his business and the strain that it placed on his personal life. And then later that night, the storm calmed. And was no longer raging outside. So the man decided to get up early. So he got up early in the morning and he walked out on the beach because he wanted to kind of survey the damage, see what happened overnight. And he noticed something interesting. He noticed thousands and thousands of little starfish just spread out all over the beach. And he knew in just moments that the sun would be breaking through the clouds and would begin to dry these helplessly stranded starfish on the beach. And suddenly he saw a real interesting sight down the beach. He saw a little boy down the beach, and this little boy was picking up these starfish and just flinging them into the ocean. And as he got closer to the little boy, he asked him, "What are you doing? Why are you doing that? I mean, can't you see that one person will never, ever make a difference here? You cannot get all these starfish back into the water. There's just too many." And the little boy reaches down and picks up a couple more and flicks them out in the water. And as he's watching him kind of sink down into the water, he turned to the man with a smile on his face. He says, "But it sure made a difference to that one." You know, God chooses to use you and I in that same way, in his endeavor to bring restoration to this broken world. But the first step that we must take is to step out of our own world and into the world of someone else. Proverbs 19:17 says, "If you help the poor, you are lending to the Lord, and he will repay you." May God find us lending a hand. May God find us living out a culture of compassion. Let me quickly share a real practical way that we can do that you can do that even this morning. Back in the lobby back there, we have a table set up with all kinds of Guatemala things on it. And one of my favorite things that we do with our Guatemala ministry is sponsor children. And we have a number of children back there that still need to be sponsored. In fact, I think there are 4. We started with 7 last service. But I think there are 4 back there right now. And then there's these little blue folders. And if you went back there and you grab one and just open it, you'll see the picture of a really cute child that needs to be sponsored. Why? Why do they need to be sponsored? Well, because it gives them the opportunity to go to school and get a really great education. It gives them the opportunity to eat a very good, nutritious meal every day. And even more than that, it gives them the opportunity to hear the gospel of Jesus and invite Jesus into their life. But you know, it goes way beyond that. And that's what I love about what they're doing at the Light of the World School. It's more than just a child, but it's the entire family. That school is committed to the entire family and spends time in the homes of those families and meeting their needs, real practical needs. Ultimately what? Giving them hope and bringing restoration to the brokenness. So I want to challenge you. I want to see all those kids sponsored by the end of this morning. Would you go back there and look at them? Would you prayerfully ask God, is this what you'd have me do today? Inside the folder, there's more information about how the sponsorship works, about the ministry down there, how you can be involved with that child's life. It is such a great opportunity, and there's other ways back there that you can be a part of our ministry in Guatemala that you'll see as well. But there are also things like our resource center right here at Foothills, practical needs that we meet in our own community, people that are hungry, people that need clothing, a way that you can serve in that capacity. You can donate. Our Backpack Buddies ministry, we feed over 100 children every single week. I gave you that statistic at Malala Elementary School. Well, we're feeding children at virtually all the elementary schools around our area every week. That's another practical way that you can get involved, that you can step into this culture of compassion. Well, I'm going to invite the worship team to come on back to the stage. And as they do, there's a story of a man who once asked God, he said, "God, why? Why is there so much struggle on this earth? Why are there so many people that are hungry? Why is there such pain?" And then he said, "And why are you not doing anything? You are God. Why don't you just fix this problem?" And God looked at that man and said, "I have done something. I created you. I created you, and I have an expectation for you to do that. And God has created you, and God has created me, and God has blessed us so much, and he wants us to use that blessing so that we can be a blessing to the world around us and be a part of his mission, to be a part of his plan to bring restoration to this broken world." Well, would you pray with me? God, there is so much need and brokenness and pain and suffering in this world. And it can seem so overwhelming at times. But Lord, we do know this one thing, that you expect us to take a step of action, to live out this life, this culture of compassion, and to make a difference. Lord, I thank you how the way Foothills is in so many ways already doing this. And God, would you continue to grow in our heart and this compassion, or this culture of compassion, so that we might be a part of your mission to bring restoration to this broken world. And we ask this and pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.